I knew the HOA was bad, but I never expected them to bring a bulldozer to my property and level my barn like some kind of suburban warlords. Yet, there I stood, staring at a pile of shattered wood and twisted metal that just a day before had been a perfectly functional barn. My barn. The one I'd built with my own two hands. It all started with Wanda Vickers, the HOA president. Middle-aged, overly perfumed, and with the kind of self-importance that made dictators look humble. She strutted around the neighborhood like she owned it, handing out fines for the most ridiculous reasons: grass too green, driveways too long, mailboxes not the right shade of beige. She had a particular vendetta against me, ever since I refused to vote for her in the last re-election. A month ago, I'd repainted my barn a deep forest green, blending it with the surrounding trees. It looked great. But Wanda? Wanda lost her mind. "This color is in direct violation of HOA guidelines," she had said, waving a printed-out document in my face. "All structures must be in approved neutral tones." I had skimmed through the HOA guidelines before building my barn. Nowhere did it say outbuildings had to be a specific color. I told her as much, but she just pursed her lips and gave me that condescending look she always did when she thought she held all the power. "You'll need to repaint it within 30 days, she snapped. I didn't, because I knew I was right. That's when the fines started rolling in. First, $500, then $1,000, then $2,000, all for failure to comply. I ignored them. Then came the threats. Wanda sent letters warning that the HOA had the authority to remedy violations if a homeowner refused to comply. I laughed. There was no way they could legally touch my barn. I should have known Wanda didn't care about legal. This morning, I had gone into town for supplies. When I came back, my beautiful barn was gone. Completely demolished. Nothing left but a pile of debris and tire tracks leading back to the road. I was still standing in shock when Wanda pulled up in her pristine white SUV, stepping out with a smug grin. "We had to take action," she said, feigning sympathy. "You left us no choice." I clenched my fists, my blood boiling. "You had no right." She handed me an invoice. "This is the bill for demolition. You have 48 hours to pay before we place a lien on your property." I swear I saw red. Wanda must have thought she'd won, that she'd stomped me into submission. But what she didn't know, what she never bothered to find out, was that my sister, Winona Garrett, wasn't just a lawyer. She was a federal judge. And Wanda had just made the biggest mistake of her life. I didn't waste a second. The moment Wanda handed me that invoice, I turned on my heel and walked straight into my house, leaving her standing there like the self-satisfied tyrant she was. She probably thought I was going inside to sulk, maybe even to start figuring out how I'd scrape together the money to pay for her destruction. She had no idea I was dialing my sister's number before my front door even closed behind me. Winona picked up on the second ring. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I didn't have the patience for it. I laid everything out for her in clipped, furious sentences. The barn, the bogus fines, the threats, and finally, the demolition itself. By the time I finished, my pulse was pounding in my ears. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice that sent a chill down my spine, Winona said, "They did what?" I could practically hear the barely restrained fury in her voice. My sister wasn't just any judge. She wasn't some local magistrate handling parking tickets. She was a federal judge with years of experience dealing with cases far more complex than HOA overreach. But this was personal. I heard her take a deep breath. Then, she told me exactly what was going to happen next. First, I was to take photos of everything, every splintered board, every tire track, every scrap of debris left behind. I needed timestamps, angles, close-ups. She was already pulling up property laws in my state, cross-referencing them with HOA bylaws. By the time I hung up, I had a clear plan. I grabbed my phone and stepped back outside. Wanda was still lingering by her SUV, probably waiting for me to come back out looking defeated. Instead, she got to watch as I methodically documented every inch of the destruction. I didn't acknowledge her presence, didn't give her the satisfaction of a single glance. She must have realized something was wrong because, after a few minutes, she called out to me. Her voice was syrupy sweet, the way it always got when she was trying to pretend she wasn't a tyrant. I ignored her. I took photos until I had covered every last bit of ground, then went inside and uploaded them to a secure drive. I forwarded them to Winona, along with copies of every letter, fine, and threat the HOA had sent me. Within the hour, she had already set things in motion. The first move was filing a police report for destruction of property. A felony, considering the value of what had been destroyed. I doubted Wanda had gotten proper permits for the demolition. If she had, I would have been notified. That meant the company she hired was also in trouble. Then came the legal filings. Winona drafted a cease and desist order against the HOA, preventing them from taking any further action against me. That was just the beginning. She was preparing to hit them with a lawsuit so massive, they wouldn't know what hit them. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout to start. The next morning, I was drinking coffee on my porch when a police cruiser pulled into Wanda's driveway. She came rushing out, her usual smug expression replaced with wide-eyed panic. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw the officer hand her a document, probably the report I had filed. Her hands were shaking when she took it. I smiled into my coffee. Wanda had spent years terrorizing this neighborhood, acting as if she was above the law. Now, the law had finally come knocking. And this was only the beginning. Wanda's hands trembled as she clutched the document the officer had given her. She kept shaking her head, her mouth moving, but whatever excuses she was spouting didn't seem to impress the cop. I leaned against my porch railing, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. The officer wasn't alone. A second cruiser had pulled up moments after the first, and now another officer was speaking with a man in a hard hat, one of the workers from the demolition crew. That was interesting. If they were questioning the crew, it meant they were investigating more than just Wanda's involvement. I set my coffee down and strolled to the edge of my property, making sure to stay well within my boundary line. Wanda's eyes snapped to me, her face flushing an unhealthy shade of red. She pointed at me, her voice rising. The officer talking to her held up a hand, cutting her off. He said something that made her jaw tighten. That's when she made her first mistake. She marched toward me, her heels clicking against the pavement. The officer called after her, but she ignored him. Her expression was a twisted mix of fury and desperation. She stopped a foot away from me, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Her voice was shrill, her composure slipping. I didn't move. I let her rant, let her dig herself deeper. The officers were watching, listening, and every word she spat only made her look worse. The officer speaking with the crew member finished his conversation and walked over. He was taller than Wanda, and when he cleared his throat, she flinched. She spun around, eyes darting between the two officers. The first officer, the one who had handed her the document, nodded. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Wanda scoffed, crossing her arms. The officer's tone remained steady, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. Her bravado cracked. The second officer pulled out a notepad. She hesitated. The first officer sighed. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. The second officer exchanged a glance with his partner before looking at me. I nodded. The officer turned back to Wanda. Her face twisted. The officer didn't react to her outburst. The second officer finished writing in his notepad and tucked it away. The officers exchanged a glance again. Wanda's mouth opened, then shut. The officer motioned for her to follow him. She didn't move. The second officer stepped forward. Her face paled. I watched as they escorted her back to her SUV. She climbed inside, her movements stiff and jerky. The officers stood by the driver's side window, speaking to her in low voices. Then, after a tense minute, She started the engine and pulled away. I exhaled slowly. The second officer walked back over to me. I nodded again. He handed me a card with his name and station number. I took the card and tucked it into my pocket. He nodded and turned away, joining his partner. They spoke briefly with a crew member again before finally getting into their cruisers and driving off. The neighborhood was quiet now. But I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. With Wanda gone, a strange quiet settled over the neighborhood. It wasn't the usual peaceful stillness of a weekend morning. It was the kind of silence that comes when people are watching, waiting. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes peering from behind curtains and blinds. I wasn't the only one who had noticed the commotion. Neighbors had seen the police cruisers, had no doubt heard Wanda shouting. The power structure of the HOA had gone unchallenged for so long that seeing her confronted like that was something of a neighborhood spectacle. I went back inside and pulled out my laptop. Winona had already sent me a follow-up email with the next steps. She had filed an injunction to prevent the HOA from issuing any further actions against my property. More importantly, she had found a critical flaw in their bylaws, something Wanda had either overlooked or ignored. The HOA's authority only extended to changes made to a property after a certain date, which meant that if a structure had been built before that time, it was beyond their control. My barn had been built well before that cutoff. That meant their entire justification for tearing it down was invalid. I forwarded the email to a few trusted neighbors, longtime residents who had also been targeted by the HOA's overreach. If Wanda had ignored the bylaws in my case, there was a good chance she had done the same to others. An hour later, a knock at the door pulled me from my research. I opened it to find my neighbor, Tom, standing on my porch. He was in his 60s, retired, with a sharp mind and a deep resentment for Wanda's leadership. He stepped inside, glancing toward the destruction in my yard. His expression darkened. We sat down at the dining table, and I showed him the documents Winona had sent. His eyes scanned the screen, and I saw the moment realization set in. His lips pressed into a thin line. I leaned back in my chair. Tom exhaled sharply and shook his head. I nodded. A slow grin spread across his face. We spent the next hour compiling a list of every homeowner who had been fined, harassed, or forced to make costly changes under Wanda's rule. By the time we were done, it was clear the HOA had been operating outside of its own legal boundaries for years. Tom left to spread the word, and I sat back, watching the emails pour in. Homeowners sending scanned copies of fines, letters from the HOA demanding compliance, even threats of liens. It was a gold mine of evidence. By the time night fell, the neighborhood was buzzing. People were talking, connecting in a way they hadn't before. Wanda had ruled through intimidation, but now that fear was crumbling. Then came the final piece of the puzzle. One of the neighbors, a woman named Cynthia, sent me an email with an attachment. When I opened it, my pulse quickened. It was a scanned copy of a financial report, one that showed a massive discrepancy in the HOA's budget. Money was missing. A lot of it. I picked up the phone and called Winona. The moment she answered, I got straight to the point. She was quiet for a moment. I heard typing on her end. A slow, satisfied exhale came through the receiver. I closed my laptop, a feeling of certainty settling over me. Wanda had overstepped in more ways than one. Destroying my barn had been a mistake. But stealing from the HOA? That was going to be her downfall. The weight of what I had just uncovered settled in as I sat back in my chair. The missing money wasn't just an accounting error, it was outright theft. Wanda had been siphoning HOA funds, and now I had the proof. Winona's voice on the other end of the call was sharp, controlled. She was already outlining the next steps, listing the agencies we needed to contact. This was no longer just a civil matter, it was criminal. I could hear her typing, pulling up legal precedents and case law as she spoke. She was already preparing to draft another round of legal filings. This wasn't just about the barn anymore, it was about dismantling the entire corrupt system Wanda had built. Tom returned an hour later, his expression tight, with barely restrained energy. He wasn't the only one. Behind him, several other neighbors had gathered, their faces a mix of anger and determination. They had heard about the missing funds, and they wanted answers. I opened the door wider, letting them inside. The living room filled with quiet murmurs as people took seats or leaned against the walls. Cynthia was among them, her arms crossed as she scanned the faces around her. She had been the one to find the financial report, and she wasn't about to let it be buried. Tom wasted no time. He laid out the situation in plain terms. The HOA had not only overstepped its authority, but it had also been stealing from the very people it claimed to represent. The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Several homeowners exchanged glances, their jaws tightening. They had all felt the sting of Wanda's fines, the arbitrary rules, the threats of liens. Now they knew where their money had really been going. Cynthia stepped forward, her voice steady. She laid out the discrepancies in the financial records, pointing out how funds had been allocated to suspicious maintenance projects that never seemed to materialize. Wanda had been lining her pockets while pretending to enforce the rules. The anger in the room was palpable. People started talking over one another, recounting their own experiences, questionable fines, sudden increases in HOA dues, unexplained charges. It was clear now that Wanda had been running a racket for years, and no one had questioned it. Until now. Tom raised a hand, quieting the room. He turned to me. I nodded, pulling out my phone and dialing the number Winona had given me. It rang twice before a clipped voice answered. I identified myself and explained that I had evidence of embezzlement within the HOA. The response was immediate and serious. They wanted the documents. They wanted statements. And they wanted them now. I turned to Cynthia, who had already pulled a flash drive from her pocket. She handed it to me, and I plugged it into my laptop, sending everything over to the investigator. Within minutes, I received confirmation the case was officially being opened. The tide had shifted. The meeting ended with a clear plan. We weren't just going to expose Wanda, we were going to dismantle the entire corrupt HOA leadership. The bylaws allowed for an emergency vote of no confidence, and with everything we had uncovered, we had more than enough grounds to remove her and her cronies. As people filtered out, their energy electric with purpose, I stood by the door, watching them go. The fear that had kept this neighborhood in check for years was gone. In its place was something stronger resolve. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, the first official move was made. A formal complaint was filed with the county authorities. The police were notified of the financial discrepancies, and the emergency vote was scheduled for the end of the week. Wanda had no idea what was coming. By midday, the news had spread. The neighborhood was buzzing with whispered conversations, quiet meetings on front porches. And then, as if on cue, Wanda's SUV came tearing down the street, screeching to a stop in front of my house. She stormed out, her face twisted in fury. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. I folded my arms, waiting. Her voice was sharp, but there was something else beneath it now, panic. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Then she made her second mistake. She jabbed a finger toward my chest, stepping closer than she should have. Before I could respond, another car pulled up. Then another. And another. Neighbors got out, watching the confrontation unfold. Tom stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Wanda turned to him, her hands clenched into fists. Tom didn't react to her outburst. Cynthia joined him, holding up a printed copy of the financial report. Wanda's face strained of color. The gathered homeowners murmured in agreement. Then, from the end of the street, a new sound cut through the conversation, the wail of sirens. A police vehicle rolled to a stop, and two uniformed officers stepped out. One of them scanned the crowd before his gaze settled on Wanda. She turned slowly, her posture stiff. The officer pulled out a document and spoke to her in a tone that left no room for argument. She tried to protest, but the other officers simply held up a hand. Then, in the middle of the street, in front of the entire neighborhood, Wanda was placed in handcuffs. The gasps from the gathered crowd were followed by a stunned silence. And then, one by one, people started clapping. As the officers led Wanda to the cruiser, she twisted around, her glare locking onto me. I watched as they placed her in the back of the car. The cruiser pulled away, and the neighborhood stood in stunned silence. The reign of terror was over. Tom turned to me, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he smiled. Cynthia nodded. There was still work to do. The HOA board needed restructuring. The missing funds needed to be fully accounted for. But the worst of it was over. As the crowd dispersed, I stood there for a long moment, taking in the quiet. My barn was gone, but something better had taken its place, a community that had finally taken back its power. With Wanda gone, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter. People who had spent years avoiding eye contact at HOA meetings were now standing together on sidewalks, exchanging updates, shaking hands. For the first time in a long time, there was a feeling of unity. But there was still work to do. The emergency vote was scheduled for the following evening, and in the meantime, the remaining HOA board members were scrambling. Without Wanda's iron grip, they were exposed. Some of them had been complicit in her schemes, others had simply looked the other way. Now, they were all trying to distance themselves from her downfall. Tom and Cynthia had been working with me all day, gathering signatures and preparing statements for the meeting. We weren't just looking to remove the corrupt leadership, we wanted real change. The bylaws needed to be rewritten, financial oversight needed to be put in place, and most importantly, the homeowners needed to take back control. By late afternoon, we had everything in order. I was outside, hauling the last of the barn debris into a rented dumpster when a sleek black car pulled up in front of my house. I wiped my hands on my jeans and turned as the driver's door swung open. Winona stepped out, looking every bit as formidable as I remembered from our childhood. She was dressed in her usual sharp, no-nonsense style, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the wreckage of my barn. She didn't say anything right away, just walked over and studied the remains. The way she stood, arms crossed, head slightly tilted, told me she was already calculating every legal angle. I leaned against the dumpster, waiting. She finally turned to me, her gaze narrowing slightly. I gestured to the pile of wood and twisted metal. She stepped closer, nudging a broken beam with the toe of her shoe. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the edge of something deeper beneath it. I nodded. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. She reached into her bag, pulling out a folder, and handed it to me. I flipped it open. Inside were printed copies of the legal filings, the injunction, and a formal lawsuit against the HOA. She tapped a page near the bottom. I scanned the section she pointed to. I let out a low whistle. She nodded once. I closed the folder, gripping it tightly. She glanced toward the house, where Tom and Cynthia were still inside, finalizing preparations. We walked up to the porch together, stepping inside to find Tom hunched over a stack of documents, highlighting key points. Cynthia sat across from him, compiling the last of the homeowner grievances into a single, organized file. They both looked up as we entered. Tom straightened in his chair. Cynthia raised an eyebrow. Winona set her bag on the table and pulled out another set of documents. Tom leaned forward, scanning the pages. Cynthia let out a low breath. Winona tapped a section of the document. Tom nodded slowly. Cynthia's lips pressed together. Winona's gaze sharpened. I watched as the weight of what she was saying settled over them. Tom leaned back, rubbing his chin. Cynthia picked up a pen and scribbled a note in the margin of one of the pages. Winona glanced at her watch. I turned to Tom and Cynthia. Tom exhaled through his nose. Cynthia closed her folder. Winona started gathering her things. I walked her to the door, the others following behind. She stepped outside, the evening light casting long shadows across the yard. I shook her hand. She gave me a brief nod before heading back to her car. As she drove away, I turned back to Tom and Cynthia. Cynthia tucked her folder under her arm. Tom cracked his knuckles. We had everything we needed. Tomorrow, the HOA was going to learn exactly what happens when they push too far.